It turns out that Junior, one of Charles's employees, had been openly criticizing his leadership. He didn't even see Charles as a real boss. Charles overheard these complaints, and now they're stuck in a heated argument. Charles should have recognized the importance of building strong relationships with his team. Meanwhile, I received an offer to work at our company's overseas headquarters. At first, I kept turning it down because of the ongoing issues and Charles's situation. But I finally accepted the offer and am now preparing for my move abroad. My decision has made my father a bit anxious, but we've started practicing video calls so we can stay connected once I leave. This role has been my dream since childhood, and I'm excited to dedicate myself to it. As for Charles, he hardly ever helped with household chores, but Angela didn't seem to mind. When they went out, Charles always took charge, letting Angela relax and enjoy their time together without stress. They seemed to have a balanced relationship. But things changed when Angela's mother suddenly passed away. Angela was at work when her father called to tell her about her mother's deteriorating health. She rushed to the hospital, but by the time she arrived, it was too late. Angela decided to stay with her father to help with the funeral arrangements. When she told Charles, he said he couldn't leave work on short notice. He ended up missing the wake and barely made it to the funeral. Charles didn't even dress appropriately for the somber occasion, and I found myself scrambling to find him suitable clothes at the last minute. Despite my efforts, Charles wasn't shy about showing his displeasure, blaming me for not preparing his outfit earlier. With the weight of the funeral already on me, I struggled to handle his complaints. Eventually, I chose to ignore them, but that only made things worse. His mood soared even further. Since that day, our marriage has felt more strained. We argue more often. It's not uncommon for couples to have disagreements after a few years, but Charles has become more confrontational. He insists on making decisions and telling me what to do, and it's wearing me down. I've tried pushing back, but his lack of familiarity with where things are in the house turns even small tasks into drawn-out ordeals, all while he grumbles constantly. Over time, it's just become more exhausting. I realized it might just be easier to take matters into my own hands, despite Charles's constant demands. I haven't always followed his directives, and lately I've been managing tasks on my own to keep things running smoothly. Just recently, I mentioned the upcoming gathering for the first anniversary of my mother's passing, and when I reminded Charles, his response was far from what I hoped for. He complained about an important meeting scheduled for that same day, questioning how he could possibly make time for the memorial. His excuse: he couldn't delegate his work responsibilities, especially after his promotion, a fact he never missed a chance to remind his team of. Frustration welled up inside me as I tried to stress the significance of this day, but it was clear that his shiny new title meant more to him than anything else, leaving me to juggle family commitments alone. No matter how much I pushed, it felt like family priorities always took a backseat to his career. Later, I came home from work to find Charles sprawled out on the couch, beer in hand. "Sorry I'm late, had to stay for overtime," I said, trying to explain, but his annoyance was clear. "I've been waiting for an hour," he muttered, his tone laced with blame. It was just an hour, and knowing he wasn't keen on cooking, he could have easily grabbed something to eat. I had even told him when I'd be home. I kept my growing irritation in check as I handed him a take-up box. "I figured cooking would take too long, so I picked this up on my way," I explained. But instead of appreciation, I got slammed with his beer glass hitting the table. "Tack out again? Aren't you slacking off a little too much lately?" His words cut deep, especially since it had been weeks since we last ordered out. Sure, I hadn't been cooking every night, but I was still doing my best to keep things together. We usually ate balanced meals and didn't rely too much on processed food, so this sudden critique caught me off guard. I debated whether it was even worth responding. But Charles, misreading my silence, added more fuel to the fire. "Can't argue when it's true, huh? Do your chores properly. You've been coming home late, claiming overtime. Maybe you're out cheating." His words hit hard, stirring up the frustration I'd been holding back. If you know I'm working late, the least you could do is make dinner. I shot back. You don't have to cook. Picking up takeout isn't that hard. I always tell you when I'll be late, and despite my busy schedule, I still manage all the household chores. There's no need for that attitude. Charles's glare hardened, and then he threw a low blow. You're 4 years older, remember? I could have married a younger woman, but I chose you. His words were meant to make me feel grateful, as if I should obey him because no one else would want me. Instead, they just highlighted how deeply broken our communication and respect had become. So, if I left, you'd be in trouble, right? I couldn't believe he actually said that. My anger boiled over. If you wanted a younger woman, you should have married one before we got together. I asked you if you were okay with my age, and you said it didn't matter. That's why we got married. Believe me, I can manage just fine without you. Charles let out a mocking laugh. Fine, let's get a divorce then, he said, grabbing his beer and takeout before storming off to his room. We'd argued plenty of times before, but this felt different. I was tired. Tired of his attitude, tired of the way he belittled me. I sat down to eat my takeout, hoping to calm myself down, thinking maybe he was just hungry and irritable. But as I ate, I couldn't shake the shock of our conversation, especially the night before my mom's death anniversary. After a while, I called out to Charles from outside his room. We need to leave by 7 a.m. tomorrow, so I'll wake you up around 6. No response came, but I was sure he was still awake. I went to bed, and when I woke up early the next morning, I noticed that Charles had already left. The bags I had packed were still in the room, so he hadn't gone to the gathering without me. Where had he gone? I tried calling his phone, but he didn't answer. He ignored my texts as well. With no other option, I left a voicemail and started getting ready to leave on my own. While waiting at the train station, I finally managed to reach him. I have a meeting. Can't leave it to my juniors, he said before abruptly hanging up. A wave of anger and resignation washed over me. I felt stunned, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. My train had arrived. Carrying the luggage meant for both of us, I boarded alone. When I arrived at my father's house, he looked at me anxiously and asked, "Where's Charles?" His eyes still carried the sadness that had lingered since my mother's passing, and I didn't want to add to his worries. Taking a deep breath, I forced a smile and replied, "He got called into an important meeting. He was supposed to come." Charles's recent promotion made it a believable excuse, so I reassured my father that it was important for him to focus on work. My father nodded, understanding. "I know he's working hard. It's a shame not to see him, but your mother would have understood. Let him know he's always welcome here," he said. There was a hint of sadness in his voice, but I kept my smile through the day. As night fell and I still hadn't heard from Charles, I decided not to reach out either. I planned to stay overnight and return home as scheduled the next day. Even though it felt a bit childish, the thought of making him his favorite meal, hamburgers, crossed my mind for tomorrow. The next day, after leaving my father's house, I got home around noon. Before heading out to the grocery store, I decided to drop off my bags. As I walked into the living room, I noticed Charles's dirty laundry scattered all over, typical. He still hadn't figured out how to use the washing machine. I sighed, gathered his clothes, and tossed them in with mine. Just as I was about to leave, something caught my eye on the table. As I moved closer, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Divorce papers already signed by Charles. My heart sank. Was this how he intended to tell me he wanted out? In disbelief, I grabbed my phone and called him, unsure if he'd even answer. To my surprise, he picked up right away. "What's the meaning of these divorce papers?" I asked, my voice filled with a mix of confusion and anger. Charles responded with a cold, almost amused laugh. "What's there to question? It's exactly what it looks like. I don't want an older wife who won't do the house chores. That's why I want a divorce. If we split, I can find a younger wife. After all, a wife is like a status symbol, right? I can't brag about you." His words hit like a punch. He reduced our years together to a shallow exchange, turning what I believed to be a partnership into something meaningless. I was speechless, struggling to comprehend how he could see our marriage this way. It's hard when my team asks about you, and avoiding the topic isn't easy, he added, his blunt criticism cutting deeper. I didn't know how to respond. If you want to avoid a divorce, start doing your chores properly. I'll be home as usual today, so make sure to grab some beer, alright? If you disagree, just take the divorce papers to court. It's your call. And with that, he hung up, leaving me in stunned silence. Charles probably thought I would comply with his demands, assuming I did the chores out of fear of losing him or wanting to prove I could handle it. He likely believed he held all the power in our relationship. Some might think being married to a younger husband is glamorous, but the reality is far from it. I had often played up Charles's youth, but the truth was, he was pretty average in every way: looks, personality, and income. There was nothing particularly exceptional about him. Referring to him as younger was just convenient. When we first got married, the 4-year age gap seemed more noticeable, but now that we were both in our 30s, it felt insignificant. It was frustrating to always be labeled as the older wife when we were practically the same age. Determined to take control of my life, I grabbed my bag and headed straight to the family court. Submitting the divorce papers gave me a sense of relief. It marked the end of our marriage. I realized I didn't need Charles, and with this newfound freedom, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. Taking advantage of the moment, I decided to request some time off work. Thankfully, my boss understood and granted me a week's leave since things had slowed down. Now officially divorced, I set out to organize my life. With few possessions, the cleanup was easy. I stored larger items in a storage unit, packed up my essentials and clothes in my car, and on a whim, decided to visit a hot spring resort. During the off-season, I found a cheap hotel without any trouble and set off, feeling a rush of excitement. As I soaked in the serene atmosphere of the hot springs and relaxed in my hotel room, my phone suddenly rang. "Angela, didn't I ask you to get beer? Where are you?" It was Charles, sounding confused and slightly annoyed. It was about the time he'd normally get home from work. I couldn't help but chuckle. "I'm at a hot spring resort," I replied. "A hot spring resort? Why? What's going on?" Charles's voice shifted, a mix of confusion and frustration. "Didn't you tell me to file the divorce papers if I disagreed with you?" I reminded him, imagining the look of surprise on his face, which only made me laugh more. "Wait, did you actually file them?" His tone quickly went from confused to concerned. "Yes, I did. It was your suggestion, Charles. Have you forgotten what you said earlier?" I replied, still amused by his reaction. His voice, now filled with anxiety, carried a hint of disbelief. "Wait, are you serious? When you say a hot spring resort, you mean some nearby spa, right? If that's the case, I'll get dinner. Come home soon." I couldn't help but laugh at his sudden shift to a more caring tone, as if he were suddenly playing the role of a thoughtful husband. It took me about an hour and a half of driving. There's even an outdoor natural hot spring, so relaxing. I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. And since you're getting your own dinner, I've already packed my things, so you don't need to worry about me coming back. Take care of yourself, Charles. He started pleading with me to return, but I had no intention of going back. You're the one who initiated the divorce, remember? Or have you forgotten? You were just using the threat of divorce to try and control me. I told you I could manage without you. Now that you've divorced your older wife, go find yourself a younger one, if you can. Whether you do or not, it's none of my business anymore, I said firmly. Charles fell silent, clearly stunned by my resolve. After a long pause, his voice finally came through, barely a whisper. "But you should consider moving out of that apartment too." "Why should I?" I responded calmly, though I had already been thinking ahead. "Think about your income. You'll go broke if you stay there. You can't clean, do laundry, or cook. You'll need housekeeping and dining out, and that costs money. If most of your salary goes toward rent, you'll be in trouble, he reasoned. I smiled a little. You always thought you were the provider, but my salary is nearly double yours, Charles. You never really provided for me. In fact, it was the other way around. I continued, getting to the heart of the matter. And just because you have one junior, you got overconfident. Did you ever stop to realize I have multiple juniors under me, and even more under them? I don't usually talk about work because you get moody, but the truth is I'd outrank you in both position and salary. You'd think, after living together for years, it seemed Charles was only now realizing the truth. Perhaps he had kept his ego intact by constantly looking down on me. Now that he couldn't, I could sense his defeat. I had shattered his pride, and in a way, it felt like payback for all those years. The reason I handled the household chores without complaint, despite his domineering attitude, was partly because I cut him some slack for being younger, and partly because it was less hassle than asking him to help. But the reality is I never needed him. I was just taking care of his needs while managing my own, so when he gave me the ultimatum, do the chores or we divorce, of course I chose divorce. We're strangers now. Goodbye, I said, saying all I needed to say before hanging up. I felt refreshed, like a weight had been lifted. I enjoyed the hotel's food, savoring the moment. Expected, Charles thought there was still a chance for reconciliation, but I had already moved on, embracing the freedom and independence of this new chapter. When he tried to reach out again, I responded with a knowing smile. I'm older than you, remember? I'm sure you wouldn't want me back. It was clear he hadn't had much luck finding companionship with younger women. Eventually, Charles realized things weren't working in his favor and moved out of the apartment. When it came time to divide the assets, I hired a lawyer, seeking more than just a fair split. Argued for additional compensation to account for the years I had managed the bulk of household chores. Always looking to cut costs, Charles decided not to hire a lawyer, which worked to my advantage. With my lawyer's help, we reached a settlement that was favorable to me, and I walked away satisfied. Meanwhile, things weren't going so well for Charles at work. His only junior team member had been openly critical of his leadership, telling others he couldn't even see Charles as a real boss. Charles overheard these remarks, leading to a heated confrontation. It was a situation that highlighted the importance of nurturing and supporting your team, something Charles had clearly overlooked. Meanwhile, in my own career, I had been offered a highly sought-after position at our company's overseas headquarters. At first, I hesitated to accept it, given all the personal turmoil and out of consideration for Charles, but as my circumstances shifted, I decided to seize the opportunity wholeheartedly. Now I'm actively preparing for this new chapter. While the change has caused my father some concern, we've found a way to adapt by practicing video calls to stay connected once I move abroad. I feel content and excited about what lies ahead, ready to pursue the career I've dreamed of since childhood. This is the moment to fully commit to this new path, knowing that I've made the right choices for my life. The future feels brighter than ever, and I'm embracing it with confidence.